Go.
This is a conversation with two of our League of Women Voters of North Dakota, longtime leaders, Bonnie Askew and Lois Altenberg. And they're going to just converse a bit about why they joined the League when they first did join the League many years back, what their most memorable experiences as League members might have been, or some of their most memorable, and what they hope for the future of the League of Women Voters of North Dakota. And so, starting with you, Bonnie, what was the reason you joined the League in the first place?
Well, we're talking about nearly 50 years ago, so please, sometimes my memory is not going to be perfect about what happened and why we did things. As I recall, I was somewhat coerced into joining the League, or going to my first meeting at any rate, by a former college roommate who was a League member in Fargo, and at that time I lived in rural Cass County. So she took me to a Fargo League meeting, and I liked it, so I stayed. And we're talking sometime, I'm not exactly sure, but probably the mid-60s, sometime or the other. That's the 1960s, guys.
Not the 1860s.
No.
And this is editable, correct? All right, so I'm going to jump in here once in a while, and I'm going to just say, this is exactly what I want, is that you two are visiting with each other and reminiscing, and just talking, and this is very great, very great. And so was there any particular issue that brought you in at that time, Bonnie?
Not that I recall at the time. As I recall, at that time the Fargo League was involved in a study of county government and that sort of thing, and Fargo city government. And I just found it very interesting. I met a group of women who were really, really very interesting women. You know, they were well informed. Their format for discussing issues and that sort of thing was good, and I was hooked, and I stayed. So I'm not sure what Lois's experience were, but Lois and I knew one another. I think by the time we both joined the League, we had met in a college dormitory.
Right.
At some time before us.
We were the two graduate students in Mackney Hall at the University of North Dakota in fall of 1959. We were together in battling off silverfish. We wanted to carry off all our cashmere sweaters. Bonnie was the only woman in the freshman law school class at University of North Dakota, and I was the only woman in the freshman medical school class at University of North Dakota in the fall of 1959.
Wow.
So then we kind of went our separate ways after that, and then we met up again in the League of Women Voters here in Fargo in 1969. I had joined the League of Women Voters in Rochester, Minnesota in 1967, and we lived in a neighborhood called Homestead Addition. There were two homesteads in Rochester, Homestead Addition and Homestead Village, where residents lived. And it was a very nice neighborhood, and I was invited to come to a evening league meeting. And I think it didn't start until almost 8 o'clock at night. Everybody had to put their kids down. And then from 8 o'clock to 10 o'clock at night, at someone's home in our neighborhood, we discussed issues such as trade with China. And I thought it was absolutely fascinating. Every meeting, we had the facts and issues. When you joined the League, then you would for every meeting you'd get a facts and issues handout. And League met every 2 weeks, so that was a lot of facts and issues. Sometimes the facts and issues would stay on the same topic. I remember that trade with China, 1967. We stayed on that topic for a couple of months. Others would be a really quick topic that would come up, something to do with government. I don't recall, though I'm sure we did, the League of Women Voters doing a lot of things locally, but we did get very much involved in politics. I don't remember doing any studying locally, but we probably did. In order to start a new League of Women Voters at that time, you were required to create a booklet called Know Your Community. And Fargo was involved in that, and then it was updated every few years. When we first went to city government, county government, to create this Know Your Community, Know Your County, Know Your City booklet, they were very suspicious of us. They wouldn't give us information, and they called around to find out what we were up to. If we were some sort of subversive society. But by the end, they had realized what a good idea it was, and they pretty much took over doing a lot of the work for us, particularly here in Fargo. I can't remember when our last Know Your Community booklet was, but
I think in the file cabinet someplace I have one tucked away somewhere, but it was, it was a real learning experience for all of us. We had a program where League members would go and observe meetings of the county commission, the city commission, and various government boards and that sort of thing. And we became very interested, very involved. You had members then start to get interested in running for political office or being appointed to these various boards and government bodies, and gradually the working relationship between the League of Women Voters and many of these government bodies became excellent. And we had, held forums for candidates so that they could come and answer questions from the public. We still do that. But I think we were probably the first people in the community that organized that kind of effort. And every election, we would produce a voter's guide, which was a nonpartisan way of explaining what the issues people would be voting on. League is a nonpartisan organization. We're accused of being otherwise occasionally, but we are nonpartisan. The membership is made up by members of both political parties, and we sometimes have some very lusty debates going on at our meetings about issues and that sort of thing. But we produced a nonpartisan, and I worked on this a lot. We tried very, very hard to explain voting measures and that sort of thing without taking a position on them, so that people would have that kind of guide. And we distributed those throughout the state. Thousands and thousands of them, that's right. And you would see people going to the polls holding a voter's guide in their hand, because sometimes it was the only really nonpartisan piece of literature that was being produced that they could depend upon to explain what it is that they were going to be voting
and
on.
our format was the same every time. It was a yes, this is what's going to happen if the yes vote prevails, and this is what's going to happen if a no vote prevails, so that people would know. And some of the measures were very tricky. They were I think the one that finally changed the name of NDAC to NDSU. It was the reverse. So if they voted no, they were in favor of it.
So framers of measures have been known to be very tricky in North Dakota, but so it was kind of necessary for somebody to say, hey, this is what's going to happen if you vote this way. And we did this for years. I remember sitting around a kitchen table someplace editing this piece of literature that went out. We would all work on it, and
we had your children there too, right?
Under the table occasionally.
Yes. But we had no jealousy over it. So we had great writers. Carolyn Bowe was majored in journalism, and we'd write down something, then everybody else would tear it apart, and we could do that without getting our feelings hurt. It was a great group.
It was really.
And then we were also lucky. Early in the 1970s, in 1972, we had a constitutional convention. And one of the people who served on the Constitutional Convention, in fact, I believe was the Secretary-Treasurer of the Constitutional Convention, was Lois Vogel, the League of Women Voters member who just died this summer. And she was outstanding on that. Unfortunately, the Constitutional Convention Committee that met for a long time did extraordinarily good work, presented an excellent new constitution, did not feel it was right for them to advertise or to promote their work. They had since changed their mind, but as a result, the negative that was felt free to see whatever they wanted to. There were certain groups that objected to one part of the Constitutional Convention. Overall, it was very good, but they objected to one. There was a group that objected to the right to work part, and I can't remember. There was something else in there too that they objected.
Well,
to.
that primarily, and interestingly enough, that group, the negative vote, or the people that ended up, was another league member who happened to be a member of the Constitutional Convention, named Mike Stanton. And as I was thinking about this in preparation for this discussion, I was trying to remember what Mike's first name was.
Jeanette.
Was it Jeanette?
Jeanette. Yeah,
Okay, because
that.
I couldn't remember.
Yes.
Everybody called her Mike as long as I could remember. And she was also a league member. Member of the county commission, as I recall too, and she spearheaded the group that opposed it, and it really was over the right to work issue, because the Constitution that came out of that convention did not include the right to work provision that is in the present Constitution, and so it failed as a result. I mean, it was too bad. A lot of that Constitution has since been enacted as
That's
amendments to the Constitution,
Right.
but not
The legislature was just shocked that this didn't pass, and then they had to mull it over, and then they have introduced then pieces of nearly everything that was in that Constitution to the voters to vote on. And because it was a well-written Constitution, the changes that needed to be made.
And this was all done by volunteer women.
No.
essentially,
Well,
volunteers.
not women. It was
Men and women.
men and women from the representing the entire state. It was a fascinating experience. Many of us participated as in testifying before various committees. As I recall, the committees were kind of set up along the same line as legislative committees, where you'd have a judiciary committee, and this sort of thing. And we presented testimony at those hearings, and as a learning experience, it was just absolutely incredible, because when you start talking about something as fundamental as the Constitution, you are really dealing with all of the underlying issues of government. And we just learned so much in that experience, and the people that participated in the convention did as well, and the participants. It was a marvelous state experience, and it's too bad it failed, but like I say, we have most of it. It has been enacted just by constitutional amendments.
Yeah, amendments that were introduced by the legislature. But I was going to say, in connection with that, our right, the yes and no votes and voters guide that we put in, that we were fortunate in having Lois Vogel always working with us. Lois Vogel, Carolyn Bowe, you, I,
Lois Casavant,
a couple others. I know there would be 6 to 8 of us around a table doing that.
I have a daughter that claims she grew up under Lois Casavant's kitchen table. So I don't know.
Oh, wonderful.
But then shortly after that, starting in 1972, the ERA, Equal Rights Amendment movement had begun, and we were determined that North Dakota was going to do our part and ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. In the legislative session of 1973, we went out, we did excellent presentation, we lined people up, we asked everybody how they would vote, and we were certain that it was going to pass. It was rational, and we figured North Dakota was rational, but we found out that many of the legislators who said that they were going to vote for it voted against it. It was the first time we found out that there were some legislators that lied. So,
I don't know if that was the first time.
So that next summer, the summer then of 1973, we met. We got as many organizations, not just women's organizations, but Common Cause.
Statewide organizations. And I think the president of the statewide league was Carolyn Moe at that time. And I can remember representatives from virtually every organization in the state met in Bismarck, and we then formed a committee or a steering committee and a group.
We didn't meet in Bismarck. We had the big meeting in Jamestown.
Oh, well, there was a Bismarck meeting before that.
Okay, Bismarck for the Jamestown.
Because I just happened, and then eventually we met in Jamestown, that's right. And a coalition was formed to ratify it, and
Donna Chalamanchik headed up that coalition.
That's right. And in 1975, North Dakota was then the 34th state to ratify.
Yay.
And we lined it up. Yeah. We had speakers. Everybody was allowed 15 or 15 seconds or 30 seconds to speak, and we had 70 people lined up as speakers and went through. We had Miss North Dakota. We had representatives of both the Farm Bureau and the Farmers Union, and we had everybody in the state just go through, and they had like 2 people that spoke.
Well, of course they had Phyllis Schlafly.
Explain who Phyllis Schlafly was. Many people maybe don't know that person, but she was a big part of why I joined the league.
Yes, she spearheaded the Stop ERA movement in the United States, and what's the name of her organization? It still exists.
I can't remember what it is, but if women were for it, she was against it.
Generally speaking, yes, and she came into North Dakota, as I recall, twice to speak to the legislators, and
in her little shirt-waist dress.
Right. Yes.
Yes, she ultra feminine looking. Was always she, is an interesting woman, to say the least. But
that we didn't trust the legislators at that time as far as voting was concerned. We had people behind every legislative desk, and if they had said they were going to support it, we were there when they pushed the button saying they were in favor of the equal rights.
Well, in 73 we lost by just 1 vote. So, it was actually somebody that had a toothache and couldn't be there that was going to vote for our side. Had to go to the dentist. And so in 75 then we were successful. And if I recall correctly, I think maybe in 77 there was an effort to rescind North Dakota's law that then failed. We were able to defeat that. And so North Dakota is still on the record as having ratified the ERA. One additional state did ratify before the time period allowed for ratifying the amendment ran out. So it ended up with 35 ratifications, which is short of the 38 that was necessary. But there continues to be an effort, to bring this back before Congress. I don't know if the time is right now, and a lot of the horrible things that they predicted would happen if the Equal Rights Amendment was enacted have actually become the norm for how we conduct our society at this time, so.
I wrote my first letter to the editor on that. about the fear of restrooms, public restrooms.
Yes, that there'd be
And now
unisex
look at the-
restrooms, you
And now
know,
look at the
and
family restrooms.
Yes,
Yes,
yeah.
you
And on
know.
airplanes, that's unisex restrooms.
I mean, but that was something horrible that was going to happen to us if the Equal Rights Amendment passed, you know, we'd have uniform restrooms. Women would be in the military. Something else that has become the norm, because women wanted to be in the military, you know, despite what Phyllis Schlafly and her fellow, those were two of their main points.
As a result of that, then, because we assume that the Equal Rights Amendment will be passed nationwide, we went through the North Dakota laws and Constitution, and we took out and we looked at anything that referred to female.
Gender
female.
specific.
Anything that was gender specific. And then we threw out the things that are referred to female cattle or female farm animals or anything else. We threw out all of those, of which there was quite a few. And then we ended up with a body of laws that we looked at that were frankly discriminatory, that had to be gotten rid of. I remember there were 5 of them specifically that League of Women Voters identified, and Bonnie and Kathy Weir, we worked putting those 5 together. We got the support, particularly the women's organizations, Seroptimist and
A number of
YWCA and AAUW and so on. And we got them to support all of these. We brought all 5 of them to the North Dakota legislature in 1977.
could be.
And I think we cannot discriminate on that. One of them had to do with if a woman's husband was transferred, then she could break her teaching contract. And that one we switched.
Well, I think gender neutral is what we aim for, is, you know, that women shouldn't be treated any differently
no.
in the law than men.
I remember the law that was based, that a woman tried to break her teaching contract because the law said that the husband may choose the domicile and the wife must conform thereto. And that was part of the law that we adopted from the New York a body of laws back when we became a state in 1889, and it had stayed there. The only time, as I said, it had ever been used was when a woman teacher, married woman teacher, tried to break her teaching contract, and was unable to do so because of it. But it was interesting. What were some of the other laws that were?
Oh, they were, you know, something that was felt to be appropriate in the 1880s that had become somewhat obsolete to thinking, but you know, there were a lot of gender references in the body of law, and you know, they weren't being observed as such for the most part, but it was just an effort to make all of our laws gender neutral, that women and men would be treated alike under the laws.
And then we had the 5 that were simple, that we were able to pass. And then the uniform laws nationwide were coming up, estate laws, divorce laws, and so on. And then Kathy Weir and Bonnie continued to work on these. And then in 1979, 1981, we addressed the inheritance laws and the divorce laws. And what else did you two work on?
Oh, well, we were trying to pass the Uniform Marital Property Act, which would essentially provide that for during a marriage that the property would become community property between the husband and wife, and we failed. That was not adopted in North Dakota. It was adopted in Wisconsin, and of course there are many states that do have community property laws in place, but it was not adopted in North Dakota.
But the other thing, up until they worked on it, and this was common, particularly in the more traditional areas in southern North Dakota, that a man could disinherit his wife, so that when he died, he could have the entire farm go to the oldest son, which was typical at that time, with the understanding that he would take care of his mother, and with one horror story after another. And then we really addressed the inheritance laws, so that.
So the league members took that on as an issue to address.
We did, yes.
Yeah, and we studied that. Then, as the League of Women Voters nationally, it covers a very broad area. It would be impossible for us to even touch on all the areas, because we're a small league, that the League of Women Voters is interested in, but particularly in water use, land use. We had a lot of interest, particularly members at Grand Forks, who were very passionate about voters' rights, land use, and water rights.
Well, voters' rights has always been near and dear to the central theme, I think, of the League of Women Voters. I did notice in the just recently that a Florida league had been part of a lawsuit to stop the enforcement of some redistricting that was done in Florida that has been found to be in violation of their constitution at this point. And League has always been very, very active in that area of making sure that everybody has the right to vote. And as we are aware, listening to the national news, there have been many efforts in many states to restrict that right to vote, make it less accessible for people, and that sort of thing. And that is just something that the League will deal with on a state-by-state basis. But in North Dakota, we were successful, and I'm not going to give a year on this, in stopping an effort to have voter registration in North Dakota. North Dakota has the distinction, and it has long had the distinction of being the only state in the union that does not have voter registration. And we felt then, and we probably still do, if it came up again, would say that we don't need voter registration in North Dakota, that we have been doing just fine without it all of this time. Now, there have been some somewhat more restrictive voters laws enacted in North Dakota within the last session that we're going to experience probably for the first time this year. It's not registration, but there have been some changes made to the kind of identification that you are going to need for voting. This is the first time you've really ever been, by law, required to have identification for voting in North Dakota. And I can remember one time being at a national convention or whatever, and
they're lively things.
You know, having, yes, this is it's totally fascinating to the rest of the United States that we were doing this because everybody else has voter registration. And Ralph Nader, who, this probably was in the 70s when I think he was our keynote speaker or something like that, and came over and engaged me in conversation because he wanted to talk to somebody from North Dakota that could tell him how this worked, you know, which was kind of fascinating. And I had to say, well, you know, everybody kind of knows everybody else in North Dakota. when you go in the polling place, they know if you don't belong, you know. And that was probably the basis for it. And, you know, to a certain extent, I think that probably still happens in a lot of polling places in North Dakota. But it was just kind of a fascinating thing. But we have always been involved in that issue, you know, and worked to make the polls accessible for handicapped people, all of those kinds of things that are important to people, and we will continue to always be involved in that because that's what's near and dear to our heart.
So there's been a lot of changes, obviously, since you started as league members.
I think I mentioned in Rochester we met at a person's home in our neighborhood at night, and when I joined the league here in Fargo, transferring from Rochester in 1969, we had like 4 different units of the league. There was like a north side unit that met in the morning at people's homes, a south side unit. There was an afternoon unit and an evening unit at that time. And it always met in somebody's home, though we almost from the beginning would meet in a restaurant or a public place. Sometimes we tried to be as neutral as we could, but so that they were small units, what, 8 to 10 women?
Oh, sometimes much larger than that. You know, some of them, you know, you had, we're talking about an era where women, for the most part, did not work outside the home. So you had units made up of women that came to, say, a morning unit or something, and met at 10, had coffee, and did whatever, you know, discussed whatever the issue of the day was, and that sort of thing. The evening unit was usually made up of young mothers and that sort of thing, who left their children to their husband in the evening and went and spent time in the evening unit. And of course, all of that has changed, because now women work outside the home for the most part, and so now we have a couple, 2 units. One meets in the evening, I think, and one meets during the day, and that's a significant change in the makeup of the league, because you no longer, you have some of us older people, but you also have a lot of young people who are holding jobs, you know, working during the day or whatever, or professional women, and that's made a big change in league.
We also used to make certain that our studies led to a consensus. So like the free trade with China, we studied that for a long period of time and came to a consensus as to whether we should initiate trade with China or whether we shouldn't initiate trade with China. And the same with the other facts and issues that came out. We came to consensus on many times during the year. 4 or 5 times we came to consensus. And we still have historically a large portfolio of areas where the league has come to consensus, and that's the basis on which we lobby. That we are not allowed to lobby on an issue unless somewhere on our local, state, or national we have come to a consensus on that issue. So the meetings that we had were even though they were in people's homes, and even though we had our coffee, and even though we were surrounded by a lot of kids, we were very businesslike, presented the issue, discussed the issue, came to consensus, and recorded the consensus, which then became part of the consensus for the city of Fargo, consensus for the state of North Dakota, and the national consensus, which we debated when we got to national conventions. You never went to a national convention unless you memorized your Robert's Rules of Order. You could not speak unless you knew your Robert's Rules of Order. You had parliamentarians, people that knew their parliamentary procedure inside and out. And if you did not know that, you'd be outmaneuvered on anything you suggested on the floor. They were very businesslike, very lively, also very contentious at times, the national conventions. And we were sent, 5 or 6 from Fargo? I know it was at least 15 from the state of North Dakota back in the early 1980s, 82, 84, something like that. It was really, really great.
I can remember being at the national convention where we voted to allow men to be members.
Yes.
Graciously, we did that.
Yes.
Can't recall if it was a close vote or not. we did do that, and you know, so we do have men that are members, but we refuse to change the name of the organization. That was also
very contentious. We
a
wanted
very
to
contentious issue as to whether or not it would be changed to the League of Voters. I think it was, and there were 2 or 3 suggestions, and we did allow men to become members, but we at that same convention refused to change the name of the organization.
We had
so-
one firebrand that got up on the floor. I remember she was tall and she had a very loud voice, and she said, "We will not change that until the Equal Rights Amendment is ratified nationwide."
It's been the women's movement, I often say, has been a very patient movement and persistent, but it's taken a long time.
It's
to get
taken a
where we are.
long time, that's right. It's I don't know, maybe it's the last civil rights movement that has been, not recognized as being fully successful, that's right.
And what about young women today? What sort of message would you hope that they would get from the work that's been, the groundwork that's been laid?
We're successful in Fargo and in North Dakota. We have one of the youngest memberships nationwide. Unfortunately, nationwide, the League of Women Voters has become an organization of people about our age. And we have done something right in Fargo. I think our meetings on Friday noons that are open to the public, I think the fact that we recognize that Fargo and Moorhead, Dilworth, West Fargo are all one community, and we meet together, and the fact that we continue to have current issues, that our membership has stayed younger than any place else in the United States, and has remained vital in the United States. And the number of men and women of all ages that we have in the League of Women Voters is unusual. But I think that's the uniqueness of the League of Women Voters in North Dakota, in Minnesota, and in the Red River Valley.
I think this is something that all organizations probably are finding, the having to change, having to modify their way of doing business, so to speak, to accommodate the changing of the demographic in many ways. Lois and I occasionally do get tired.
I get tired babysitting grandchildren. That's what really wears me out.
You can't just put them under the table at a league meeting anymore. But like every other organization, we have to change, and we have to move forward and change our way of doing business, so to speak. But I think organizations that are devoted to the public interest and public good are a vital part of our culture, and they have a place, and they need to be maintained. We need a place where we can talk about things. And it's not to say that league meetings didn't have controversy, because they did. We were made up of a lot of different people that had a lot of different points of views.
Right.
And sometimes it could get a little tense. And there have been times when our membership has suffered because of our position on certain issues. The Equal Rights Amendment, reproductive,
Rights.
not everybody was always on the same page on these issues, but we tried to maintain our membership and accommodate different points of view. But when we did come to a conclusion that this is what the organization stood for, then we moved forward with it. And sometimes we lost people, sometimes we didn't. Sometimes they just stayed and tried to make their viewpoint heard. Reproductive rights was very controversial for the league in this state. There have been issues like that. So but on a whole, a lot of people still support the core issues, the basis for the organization, and that is an informed voting public. And
I think we involved our families, and I think our families were impressed. And my sons and my grandson now is on the board, the local board of the League of Women Voters. So we engaged our families, and our families were involved. And friends and neighbors and so on have joined the League of Women Voters because we represented the League of Women Voters.
Well, you're two of my heroes. for sure, always have been. And I think we've picked up a number of wonderful gems of your experiences. Do you think there's anything additional that we want to get from them? We have I think we've got a lot of material to work with. And I think you two are just a perfect example. I know that your political affiliations
Oh, we did
have
that.
been
We did that.
different.
We did that intentionally, and I forgot to say that. We realized when we were working on the Equal Rights Amendment, the only way that we were going to really affect politics in North Dakota or the legislature is that we did have to get involved in the parties. So we decided at a meeting that we were going to choose which one of the party conventions we were going to go to. And some of us chose to become Republicans, and some of us chose to go to the Democratic conventions. And I was, and I remember Donna Chalmanchuk and I went to both that year. And for some reason, I think they both were in Fargo that year. So we went to the Republican convention, or maybe they were different places. But I remember going to both of them. And the League of Women Voters, I want to say, has always been gentlemanly in our discussion. We've always allowed the other side to speak, and we have not done any character assassinations of these things we're discussing. I was shocked at my first, it was both Republican and Democrat, and it must have been summer of 75 or something like that, that the name calling, the character assassinations, the misrepresentations. I was just thrown back, and I got used to it. But Bonnie chose to stay associated with one party, and I had chose to stay associated with the other, which was good for the League of Women Voters, because the League of Women Voters has always been said to be one party, and yet we did a poll and found that it actually had more members that were in the other party. So we represent a lot of independents, but we represent members who are active in both the Republican and the Democratic Party.
We find our commonality in the issues, you know, that we support or oppose, and not we don't support candidates, so we don't get involved in that aspect of it. You know, individually, a lot of our members, of course, do support individual political parties and individual candidates, but that's fine. We just stay to the issues.
And over the years, we've had people who have been successful in running for office. Mm-hmm. Some of the early people that were active in the League of Women Voters in Grand Forks and in Fargo that went on to become stellar members of the North Dakota legislature were Loa Eagles and Stella Fritzel of Grand Forks, Loa Eagles of Fargo.
And there are other ones too, we've just forgotten. But
Kay Can.
Yes.
Kay Can. Carolyn Nelson.
You can't study the issues very long with Kit Sherber was a member of the legislature that was also a Fargo League president at one time. So there have been a number of them, you know, and on many boards and commissions have been people by League members. So, you know, I think we've had some influence over the years. So.
Excellent, excellent. Well, I think this was just wonderful. I think we have some real gems. And as you probably both know, I think I told you that Catherine Rodney's daughter interviewed her, and I have a complete transcript of that discussion about her early involvement, and then she talks about some of the meetings and some of the names that you both have mentioned. And then they sent to me a number of photographs. I just printed off a couple just for fun to show that this was Catherine's first arrival in North Dakota, 1945, and this is her going door to door in the 70s with her big glasses like we all have.
Didn't we all have those?
Yes, exactly. And this was on her 90th birthday.
Yes,
And
the red hat, with the red
Yes.
hat society
Yes.
friends, yes.
So what we will do in this film then is hopefully we'll get someone in her family, or we'll have someone in the league read some of this, again, editing all of this conversation, but then we'll have some of her words in there and some of her pictures in there as well,
Look,
along with you two.
You know, and Catherine, of course, was involved in the original
She was
league,
one of the
you know,
founders. Yeah.
she was one of the founders, that's right. Lois and I, believe it or not, were too young to do
Yeah,
that.
right.
Well, and she does describe those early reasons that she and Carolyn Moore and Lois Cassavant, their main complaint was about some of the city streets, and that was where it began. And of course, they had come from other states, so they were familiar
That's
with
right.
the league.
They were all transplants.
Yes, and so they brought it
That's all.
from those locations and then went ahead with that. And I remember very well a number of times over the years that Catherine Rogney has come to meetings and has talked about those early days, going out to meet in various communities to see if they could get a league started and dealing with a lot of the...
Well, and of course, they ran right into headlong into the forerunner of the Tea Party, which was the John Birch Society.
Oh, yes.
Exactly.
Which was very active in North Dakota at
Yes.
that time and very opposed to the League of Women Voters.
Oh, yes.
Yep. And she does refer to them here. The
Yes.
John Birch Society was flourishing, and they were flooding the state with John Birch. They decided that the League of Women Voters was a communist group, and the people in Mandan didn't want such an organization established in their town. But she said the Mandan newspaper was on their side, and so they, Bismarck was a hot potato, she said. So
Yeah.
there's some real interesting tidbits in
And they
there.
did establish a Mandan League.
Yes,
So,
they did.
you know, we had leagues in most of the cities in
One of
Dakota.
one of the last big state conventions that we had was in April in Mandan, North Dakota, on the hottest day ever recorded in April. It was 102 degrees in
Oh.
April in Mandan, and we had our convention.
Maybe that was 1980, was it?
Yeah, it was a hotel downtown Mandan.
There
I'm
was a
sure it's
hotel
got-
downtown Mandan, I do remember it. Yes.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I know that the obstacles that the league has faced in North Dakota and that you two just reminisced about just point to the fact that there can be civility, there can be discussions about differences, and really nobody does it better than the league.
That's
when
right.
it comes
That's right.
to having those.
And I'm proud of that with our candidates meeting.
Yes.
And we've always kept it civil, kept it fair, kept it equal. We allow candidates to hand out their literature at the back of the room, to meet people and so on. But as far as the debate is concerned, it's always been equal and fair, and everybody has the same opportunity to speak. And then questions are written, they come from the floor, and that's to keep anybody from trying to take over or to repeat the same question over and over again. Harassment.
My favorite Meet the Candidates story came out of West Fargo. It was a county-wide meeting, but it was held in West Fargo. I just kind of remember that. And everybody in the sheriff's department was running for sheriff that year. You know how they have a tendency, all the deputies occasionally run against the sheriff. And in the middle of the meeting, they had to break it up because there was a jailbreak. Everybody was at our Meet the Candidates.
Oh, funny. Oh, no. Back to work, everyone.
Back to work.
Oh, that's funny. That's
Well, we
funny.
better break it up. I think they're breaking
It's
down the
time.
board. Yes.
It's time.
Oh, we
Thank
had
you.
to